Okay, let me share my screen.
Okay, so let me open first, okay?
Okay.
Okay, wait. Hello everyone, welcome to Wednesday Forum, Interweaving Wisdom every Wednesday. Thank you for your coming on the second Wednesday Forum on this semester. Wednesday Forum is a weekly discussion, starts from 2002, and this event is jointly organized by CRCS UGM and ICRS. CRCS, or Center for Religious and Cross-Cultural Studies, offers master degree on religious studies at Graduate School, Universitas Gadjah Mada, and ICRS, Indonesian Consortium for Religious Studies, a consortium consisting of 3 universities, UGM, UIN, Sunan Kalijaga, and also Duta Wacana Kristen University, also located at Graduate School UGM. So last week, we went to Bima with Professor Adlin Sila, and today we will go 2,000 kilometers away to the southeast, precisely in the village of Taiftok, Mollo Mountains, Timor East Nusa Tenggara. And we'll be there in a few minutes with Harriet Crisp. So Harriet is a CRCS alumna just recently, and currently she works as a copy editor for Jakarta Post. Harriet will present her research of indigenous literature on with a focus on Molo community, Lakoat.Kujawas. If you're familiar with the name Lakoat.Kujawas, Diki Senda, the founder of Lakoat.Kujawas, had presented in this forum a few years ago. So Harriet will talk also about Lakoat.Kujawas, but more focusing on indigenous literature. So what does indigenous literature mean, and where does Indonesian fit into this? And for the Lakoat.Kujawas community, what does this effort to rewrite or retalk about this indigenous literature mean to them? So without further ado, Harriet, you have 45 minutes for presentation, and after that we will have a discussion. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Harriet.
Okay, thank you everyone for joining. I've been coming to the Wednesday forums now for a long time, and so I feel honored and a little bit overwhelmed to be asked to do this presentation. And it was also, as just mentioned, Diki Senda's Wednesday forum where I first heard about LakoatKujawas and thought, if I do study at CRCS, I'd really like to focus on this community and think about literature. So this feels like a full circle in a way. But first of all, what is Indigenous literature, and what do we mean when we talk about it? A lot of people have asked me, have questioned, why would I want to study Indigenous literature? Normally, when you think about Indigenous communities, you think about the oral tradition or singing or weaving or performance or these mixtures of tangible and intangible storytelling. And often if you think about the written text, it's related back to colonialism and the colonial archives or research which is done about Indigenous communities. Also, if we think about history, often we champion the written text as the authority over orally shared stories. So this got me thinking about communities who are writing literature, who do call themselves Indigenous. And another strand of thought within this is when we talk about literature, we also think about national literature or a national canon. And who is selected to be part of this, and who makes up this national imagination or this imaginary nation, and where do Indigenous or adat or aliran kepercayaan groups fit within this, and other questions. You could go on with questions about the language written in, and about publication and audience. So these were the questions that I've been thinking of when I started my process of researching. I just wanted to introduce 3 novels that are written by Indigenous authors who call themselves Indigenous authors. The first one is There by author Tommy Orange, who's Jayan and Arapaho from North America. And in this novel, I selected it to be included in here. Could have been poetry or theatre or so on, but here he uses techniques such as including essays about Native American history and trauma, and he focuses on Native American communities living in urban areas. So talking about Native American culture or Indigenous culture doesn't have to primarily be about the past, but very much how this is rearticulated or translated into today. Siaman Rapongan and Golda Mo are both Asian Indigenous authors who were writing. Siaman Rapongan in Taiwan, and his novels focus on, and poetry focus on what it means to be from the Tao tribe in Taiwan, and the challenges of living in an island where you're not particularly seen. And Golda Mo, as a Malaysian author and from the Iban community of Borneo, she's written extensively outside of her novels in how to write as an Indigenous author, looking at different, how to research and how to include information for an audience who is not necessarily from your tribe. So I wanted to include these as a kind of a reflection on what I was thinking of as well when I was coming up with this topic. But to take a step back, what do I mean by indigeneity? If you think about Indonesia and adat communities or followers of indigenous religions, a lot of the time the stereotypes that come to your head are people who are primitive is a word that is often used or has been used in the past, or traditional or customary. But recently in academia and on the ground, indigeneity has also come to mean a global transindigenous working together. So Nielsen in 2003, when this idea of indigeneity was really beginning to flourish globally, he saw indigeneity as an attachment to some sort of subsistence economy, to a territory or homeland predating settlers, a spiritual system predating missionaries. And these communities share the destruction and loss of these things, and also commitment to finding stability and using the tools to come to bring it back. I like what Clifford mentions here, who says that being Indigenous, it means a work in progress. And Rush says that being Indigenous is about translating those pre-colonial or past traditions into the present to give it a new vocabulary. So other theories that I've used within my research comes with articulation. So to put it very briefly, articulation is the idea that ideologies or identities or vocabulary that communities use to describe their situation don't come to them, but it discovers the subject. So often these ideologies exist and then they discover a subject and it gives the vocabulary to talk about the experience that a community is having. So Tanya Mari Lee, who was writing about this in the context of Indonesia, said that rather than viewing identity as a fixed ground from which insights and actions follow, Hall argues that new interests, new positioning of self and others, and new meanings emerge contingently. So if we apply articulation to Indigenous people, it's not about, being Indigenous isn't about primordial transhistorical attachments and ancestral laws or spirituality or respect for Mother Earth, but it's pragmatic, it's entangled, it's contemporary, and it's Indigenous cultural politics. Okay, so the final chunky theory that I've been using for this thesis relates to Indigenous methodologies. So I, with an awareness that I am a foreign researcher studying in Indonesia and wanting to study about communities such as Lakoat.Kujawas, you can't shy away from the dynamics and the politics of academia and of the history of research and how sometimes it can be a little bit abstractive, extractive, sorry. So I was trying to think about, when I was thinking about Indigenous literature, how it is a form of methodology in itself. So when a community is writing, they are doing research beforehand, and in the process of writing, it's this articulation of the self. And in the 1990s, a field of Indigenous methodology started developing, where Smith said that method is important because in regarding how knowledge is acquired or discovered, it's how we know what is real. So it's very important when studying communities to be thinking about your own position and how you decide on your epistemologies and ontologies and values. So I think literature works particularly well when thinking about method and thinking about research, because as Paula de la Velle said about Maori literature, it's not about Maori communities written by the colonizer, but it's written by Maori communities as an act of appropriation and self-determination. So how does this fit in with Indonesia? I've mentioned previously about adat and aliran kepercayaan, but how does this fit in with the idea of indigeneity and the global indigenous movement? I really like this quote from Swayze, who was also previously at CRCS, who said that culture, or adat, is correspondent and in fact indexical of the local and the particular, identifying regions as places of primordial origins. This is located in distinction to religion, a realm of modern national citizenship and participation, cosmopolitanism, and the transnational ties that reiterate the global-local hierarchy. So any exploration of adat and subsequent discussions of indigeneity should come with an understanding of the religious structure underpinning the Indonesian nation and binaries between adat and cosmopolitan and national and local. So to put it more simply, we can't look at adat without thinking about what it means to be regional or rural, and what it means to be particularly local in comparison to religion, which is seen as national or global and modern and cosmopolitan. So I've used this as a way to pin what I think Indigenous literature in Indonesia comes to mean. I created a potted history of indigeneity in Indonesia. I won't read through it all, but what I pinpointed is that, similar to across the world, land and beliefs are central to what it is to be indigenous. So in the past, in the Dutch colonial period, those who weren't Muslim were seen as free for conversion, even if they were following a local religion or were animists. And this kind of developed the sense that those who weren't following a world religion were non-religious, as we can also see today. Adat first came into fruition in the early 1900s after Van Vollenhoven, the Dutch academic, saw that there were indigenous customary laws and traditions, which he termed as adat. And then this later on was re-articulated to mean masyarakat adat, or indigenous people in Indonesia in the 1990s, following modernization and development projects in the New Order period. And recently we've seen the development of aliran kepercayaan, or local religions, being allowed into the national identity by citizens being able to say that they follow an indigenous religion and not just one of the 5 religions of Indonesia. Okay, so where do we find indigenous literature in Indonesia? Going back to, if we go back to the previous slide, going back to the New Order and masyarakat terracing, there was this idea in the 90s and between the 70s to the 90s that those who lived in rural areas were often more backwards and less developed and in need of development than those who lived in urban areas or were, for example, from Java. And after 1998 and after 1999, there was a wave of decentralization where all of the politics and culture moved away from the center of Java, and there was a celebration or a changing or a shifting in what the national identity was and what local identity is. And I think you can see that within literature as well in Indonesia. So Fanani writes that where early Indonesian novels sought freedom from adat and the limitations of traditional society, current novels tend to seek the constancy of ethnic identity. And this is perhaps in line with international trends towards group identification. So Fanani here also links, in some ways, what is taking place within Indonesian literature and decentralization to global indigeneity if we think about group identification. Ilma and Pak Thawar also argue that in local culture, wisdom and specific politics and positions of local religion have become central themes within Indonesian novels and Indonesian literature after decentralization. Going back to 2002, when just after decentralization, Dirks writes about an explosive increase of local and regional literary life. And we can see this through the huge range of literary communities, a bit like Lakoat.Kujawas that have developed recently, and local festivals such as Makassar Writers and Readers Festival and Sangihe Festival that is running currently. Even if there aren't many writers, so I've been looking for writers who talk about Indigenous literature and academics, and I haven't yet found any in the context of Indonesia. Mostly it is about kearifan lokal or adat within literature or regional literature. And I think we can see that this comes from the relationship between adat, where there aren't particularly set communities who, 1 second, I'll just take a drink. So yeah, I haven't found any other writers or researchers talking about Indigenous literature. And I think that just comes because this decentralization and this look at regional literature reflects the politics of adat and the ways in which most writers who are talking about adat within literature perhaps wouldn't describe themselves as Indigenous themselves or as adat themselves, but it is in their past and in their history, such as Entrop by Oki Madasari, or this story, The Batang, which talks about the challenge of moving away to a city and your family still being in a adat community, and the pull and push of wanting to go back there, but also wanting to have your life in the city. So moving to talking about Lakoat.Kujawas and Molo and the Molo, I'm sure many of you already know about Lakoat.Kujawas. It is a community that is in the village of Taiftob in south central Mollo in Timor. Across Timor, the population is primarily Protestant, but in Taiftob, Catholic. And within that, there are small pockets of communities who are adat or aliran kepercayaan, and many who share elements of adat traditions and who still follow these beliefs. Atuin Pahmeto is the main group across the region, in which the Molo are a sub-ethnic group. And I just wanted to mention briefly here that despite the region being quite rural and far from cosmopolitan capital, the area has always been a center for migration and trade, whether that be for hardwoods or whether that be for fruit. And the population has a long history of enculturation with Chinese and also transmigration from other regions of Indonesia. So Mollo is primarily known for the mining that took place in the 90s and the protests from women miners that happened at the time. So for those who don't know, Mama Aleta Bone, one Mollo woman, organized everyone in the villages around Mollo to go to the mining sites that took place in these rocks, which are sacred to the community. And here they weaved in the mining pit. And it was a long experience and it was very traumatic, but in the end, the mining of the marble was stopped. And when asked why the community felt that it was so important to stop this mining, Mama Aleta Bone famously said, "Pohon bagai rambut dan kulit, air bagai darah, batu bagai tulang, tanah bagai tubuh," which translates to tree as hair and skin, water as blood, stone as bone, land as body. And this cosmology that Mama Aleta Bone described then has continued through and has shaped a lot of what Lakoat.Kujawas has focuses on today. Central to Molo culture is Mutis Mountain, which Papa Okto, one of the adat heads who helped with Lakoat.Kujawas, explained to me was Digeneity, of fulfilling. So humanity is always lacking, everything is lacking, and they have to go to Mutis to be fulfilled. And across Molo, what is central to identity and stories is that of the rocks of the Fatu, and every clan has their own Kanaf, which shares their story and their identity and their place. Similarly, as part of the cosmology, Uisneno, who is now seen as who is also the Christian god, alongside Uispa, the god of the land, and Uiswel, who is god of water. But as Mama Fun, one of the community members of Lakoat.Kujawas, explained to me, the last two aren't often worshipped in the same way. Introducing Lakoat.Kujawas, the community started in 2016 as a social enterprise. So one of the primary aims of this community, as well as revitalizing and redescribing the traditions and the histories of the community, is also creating a sense of self-sustainability and generating of income. And so Lakoat.Kujawas and the creative writing class in which they create their literature to the Lighthouse was developed with the local Catholic school, SMPK, St. Joseph Rendemitz Kapan. And I think this is quite an important point that I'll come back to later, that it's not solely trying to return to traditional or the original beliefs, but this is the new, they class themselves as a bridge between adat and modernity and between adat and the church. So writing is just one of their activities. Currently, they are working a lot on the development of a food, on food knowledge from the area. They engage a lot with local adat groups, and they visit a number of sacred places around the land. And they also engage with other charity, with other large funding institutions and with other adat groups from around Indonesia and around the world, as well as other communities that aren't related to indigeneity or adat. So for this research, I was really hoping to be able to go there after watching Kak Diki's talk in 2017 or 2018, I guess, 2018. But unfortunately, at the time when I was writing my thesis, the pandemic began to really hit Indonesia. And so it was considered safest and most responsible if we just tried to figure out how to do this research online. So over the space of 5 months, I was allowed to join the creative writing classes of the community. I sat here at this desk and together we would write and we would share ideas. I also engaged in interviews with a number of the students who you can see in this picture, alongside Mama Fun, who is now one of the key figures of Lakoat.Kujawas beside Kak Diki. She is an amazing storyteller and chef, and she is trying to bring back the knowledge from her own grandmother about picking food in the region. And Papa Okto, who is not in this picture, is another key figure who has tried to bring back a number of the traditions and the stories and the rituals of the Molo by visiting a lot of the local schools. And one thing that I want to mention here that is important is that when they talk about adat, or when they talk about coming back to Molo traditions, because they view that there is a distance between the knowledge that their previous generations had with theirs, they see this bridge not as something negative, that they are far from their culture, but something that gives them space to be able to critique elements and to bring what they want forward and to leave whatever is not beneficial for the present day behind, and to connect this with the church. So to do the same with the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church, or also within the community. So I think being a bridge is an important word within the community. So I mentioned briefly about the mining that took place in Mollo. But if we return to Swayze and talking about the idea of modern and non and global and local, there have been a number of challenges that the community has faced throughout history. So some of these being, at school, it's always taught in Bahasa Indonesia, and the local language of Dawan is not allowed. And this has created a vacuum where nowadays young people don't always speak Dawan. There has also been the development of industrial forests throughout history, which has removed some of the native tree species. Climate change and environmental damage, as is causing devastating impacts around the world, is being felt there and changing the local knowledge about the weather, which I'll come to in a second too. And also there is a lot of economic migration, which changes the dynamics of understanding of poverty and of identity when so many young people are moving away from the region. Okay, so these are the 3 books that have currently been published by the community. I have 2 of them here, but Dongeng Dari Nunu how many I'm yet to read. These 3 books are compiled by the short stories and the poetry of the students from the school. Dongeng Dari Kapnan Tofena is primarily short stories. Some of these are based in the stories shared by the families and stories shared by their friends. Some are the complete imagination of the students themselves. And when I first read this, I was laughing at times and crying at times. It's a really beautiful book. It's written in Bahasa Indonesia, as they all currently are. But recently, the community has been working on a project to translate the stories into Bahasa Dawan. Tubuhku Batu, Rumahku Bulan is a book of poetry. And I think you can really see the transition between the first book to the second, and how the community think about the important elements to Molo culture in terms of really honing in on elements such as rocks and trying to explore the emotions that come up with thinking about these elements. So to go back to the idea of Indigenous literature, when I was interviewing Kak Diki, I asked him, what was it that you wanted to achieve with the publishing of the books? What audience were you considering? Was it audiences around Indonesia? Were you thinking about a global market? And he said to me, and this is translated, initially we weren't writing with the intention of publishing. From the beginning, we wanted to write about our local knowledge for our own consumption, because we have grown in an environment where there have been limits limits to reading materials, limits to local knowledge, until we thought that we have to bring this narration, this knowledge, and put it into texts within books ourselves. And then these can become the sources of local knowledge for the community. This was the plan initially. So the creation of these books and everything we've created wasn't with the tendency or the intention that these books will be read by others, or with the intention to be critiqued or praised, although this has been the impact. It was instead with the intention that these books were published so they could be used and accessed by all young Molonese who wanted to learn about Mollo culture. So in this process of writing for the community, I wanted to just spend a bit of time talking about how the community, what is the time? How long have I been talking? There's still time. So within the creative writing process itself of the community, and the creative writing class is called To the Lighthouse, I wanted to illustrate here the kind of the length and the thought that goes into these classes. So classes by the community aren't solely just about sitting and writing, but there is a long process of engaging with local adat communities, as you can see in the bottom right picture, where sessions will take place where a particular element is discussed. So in this picture here, they're talking about marriage rituals and ritual speak. When I first joined the community, they were having a class about reading the sky, membaca langit. And here they were learning about all the ways that traditional Molo knowledge was used to understand the seasons. So if the moon was in a particular place, that would mean that the dry season would come. From this knowledge, we would then sit down and we would write a preliminary piece, and we would discuss what we felt about the talk. And then after that, we would go away, and the next day we would come back with another story. And at the time when I was also joining the community, there was the release of the film Our Mother's Land. And this film by Febriana Firdaus goes to Molo and interviews Mama Letabaun and Mama Richi about what it was like being a woman in the period of the mining and the mining crisis. And so the community of Lakoat.Kujawas watched this film together, and then they invited some of the women in the mine to then talk about the experience. And from this, we would then begin to write stories. So every story that is involved within these books comes from a long process of research, of interaction between the community with elders before it is written. And now that it's being translated into Bahasa Dawan as well, it's coming full circle in that the language and the knowledge within it is coming back to the community and coming back for people of Molo. Of course, these books have also been published, and as I am sat here reading them, and I'm sure many of you have read these books as well, they have come to a wider audience. And many of the students have said to me that in having these books published and in others reading these stories, it has really increased their sense of confidence and their sense of understanding that despite being from a rural area, despite being on the periphery of Indonesia and being adat or being from a kampung, their stories still matter. And then this then, Kak Diki explained to me, this then helps them think about how they want to represent themselves to the outside world or to others. So coming back to the idea of Indigenous literature, I want to come back to Tuhuwai Smith, who says that the process of communities creating their own education for their stories and coming to know the past is creating its own critical pedagogy. And to hold alternative histories is to hold alternative knowledges. So the implications of this access to alternative knowledge is that they can form the basis for alternative ways of doing things. Data, who also writes about stories and writing stories as research, says it empowers people, and the research becomes ours rather than theirs for our own communities. Kazakh calls this a storied approach to research. So I just wanted to go over two stories or two pieces of writing that the first was done during my time in the class, and the second is from Dongeng dari Kapnan Tofena. So this story comes from Indy, and Indy is 15. And in this class, we were all told to write letters, and these letters could be to anybody. It could be to an element, you could write to the weather, you could write to a tree, or it could be to an ancestor, or and you didn't have to mention who this letter was to. So Indy speaks here to her friend, to her Sohabat, and within this letter, she talks about this gap that she has seen develop between herself and nature. She says, I'm confused because I don't know how to share what I want to say about nature. I want to tell a lot of people outside to look after and protect nature, but I don't know enough myself to be able to do this. She also talks about the knowledge of the moon that her ancestors had, how it was like watching a film. And I think what I find interesting from this letter is this sense of awareness of there's more that I need to learn, and that I will. She ends the letter saying, I hope that we can get closer to nature again before it's too late. So these are the kind of reflections that are taking place in the class and coming into the writing. One story that I also want to talk about here is Pohon-pohon kasuari pernah mati kecuali pohon Lakoat. And this, I want to focus on the idea of history within stories. So Sandra wrote this story based on a tale that she was told by her friend from a village nearby to Taiftob called Adjawab-Tomas. And Adjawab-Tomas, the name means Adjawab, which is a pine tree, and Thomas, who is the main character of the story. So this story comes from the perspective of a Lakoat tree. And this tree has sat through history and watched as a huge storm ripped through a pine forest in which someone called Thomas was sat under a tree and he passed away. And the story follows the life of this tree as he sits, and people come and respect him because he is the final tree standing. And in the end, he says, "Sementara aku sudah ingin melupakan peristiwa yang paling menyedihkan 100 tahun lalu, aku sudah terlalu tua." The tree wants to forget these memories. On a very basic level, I think this story is important because a lot of what LakoatKujawas does is related to seeing the perspective through nature and the relationship between the surroundings of Molo and the perspective of being a human within it. Also, this story, there's two stories that I have been told about Adjawab-Tomas. And the other is that Thomas was against the Dutch colonial government who were nearby, and one time he was murdered and left under a tree. So there are two stories related to this. And when I asked Sandra whether she knew about the other story, she said, yes, these are the two stories that I know about Adjawab-Tomas. But I chose to write about this one, and I chose to change the perspective from a pine tree to the Lakoat tree so that it relates to our community, and we are the tree that continues to grow. And then that got me thinking about the oral tradition and how stories have this movement and this life by themselves, and they change and they morph. And regardless of whether it is this story where Thomas is killed by thunder or and lightning, or the story where Thomas is killed by the colonial administration, that within both stories there is a truth. And within both stories, there is something that is being shared, and that has remained until this point that Lakoat.Kujawas are talking about it today too. So I'm going to end on this poem. This is from the second book, Tubuku Batu Rumahku Bulan. And I won't read it out loud because I'll just butcher it with my Indonesian. But I think I wanted to display this because within this poem, it has Gunung Mutis, it mentions Tuhan, or God, and it describes Bonlieu, which is an area near Mutis where many people come to do rituals. So I'll end my presentation there. Sorry for being a bit nervous and stuttery throughout this. I'm not very good with presentations, but thank you so much for listening. And I look forward to any questions or comments you have.
Okay, thank you very much, Harriet. And oh yeah, I want to say hi to Kakak Diki Senda. I saw that he also here. With oh yeah, if you want to ask a questions, you could do it in 3 ways. You could raise your virtual hand, and also you could also write on the chat box, and you could, if you on the YouTube, you could also write it on the chat. So is there anyone who wants to question or comments? Okay, feel free. Wait. Wait, I'll see YouTube. Yeah, okay, we have one from Awal Hidayat. Please.
Hi, good afternoon. Hi, Harriet. It's nice to meet you here. Yeah, thank you so much for the insightful session presentation. And yeah, I really want to say thank you because you took research on Lakoat.Kujawas, like the indigenous community in Indonesia. But I'm more focused on the education system. Like, could you elaborate like how the community develop or design the curriculum in the process of the teaching and learning, and then like how they deliver the lesson? Is it like mostly like the discussion or like the lecturing or whatsoever? And how is there like any assessment criteria or grading to the students, and how they bridge between the education system in community and the formal education that they attend in the SMP, as you mentioned earlier? So that's the first question. And then the next one is, like, we know that religion and adat sometimes don't really correspond to each other. Sometimes they contradict, and that's usually what happens like in Indonesia historically. Like there are many indigenous tribes were diminished because of the religious values, and many like the local religion feel oppressed because of that. And how like the Lakoat.Kujawas bridge the contradiction between religion and adat, and how they compromise between them. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Awal. Good questions. So the community with their classes, they initially started out as after-school classes, so they were still involved within the school, and they are still to this day. But they have they wanted to develop this contextual education because they saw that so much of the curriculum was based on what was happening in Java, or history that wasn't, or lessons that weren't particularly relatable to the community itself. So they developed these after-school classes with the priest, Romo Jimmy, from the school, who supported them and gave them the space to have the classes. But what I've seen has developed recently. They've created what's called School Tamalot, and this is their own adat-based education, where they have normally discussions with people who come from different adat groups. Either they come to Lakoat.Kujawas, to Taiftob, or the community goes and visits specific places, and there they will have discussions. And as I mentioned with the creative writing classes, that's where they then reflect on what has been discussed through through writing. As far as I know, there's no grading or anything that goes with this. It's all very much about the lived experience and knowing who you are through your identity. A lot of the students really want to go to university and to continue this work in a higher education platform as well. But it's primarily about the sharing with different community members. And then, one other thing that to add to this, the books that they create. So these textbooks, I mentioned in the quote from Kak Diki that this Molo knowledge is then to be shared with other people in Molo. These books have been delivered to schools around the region. So students at these schools can read the creative writing and the poetry developed by Lakoat.Kujawas too. That's for your first question. For your second question about the relationship between religion and adat, historically, yes, everyone who I have spoken to in the community, and this is where I think that there is probably a gap in my research and not having been able to go there, and only speaking to a number of people over WhatsApp calls. So this is an opportunity for more research in this topic. From what I have heard from a number of different members of the community, in the past, a lot of trauma has taken place after, for example, 1965, where not because of the religions themselves, but because of the situation where if you didn't have a religion on your KTP, or if you were doing what seemed like animism, you were potentially not religious. That caused a lot of these traditions and rituals to become dormant. I'm going to say dormant here. And Kat Dickey has posted about this on his Instagram today, I think. But within how Lakoat.Kujawas functions today, the church is very active within the community, the local church. A number of people I have spoken to, such as Mama Fun, who is part of the community, said others outside the community don't fully understand. They say, why would you want to learn about these rituals and these old beliefs? And there is a conflict between what is seen as modern and developing and what is tradition. But within the community, I don't know where the boundary is between, I don't think there's a boundary between what the Catholic Church in Taiftob or the Protestant Church sees as the limit for them to learn about Molo traditions, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think it's very sensitive topic, especially in Indonesian, and yeah, I think there is like a need to do like the further research on that specific aspects. But yeah, thank you so much for your great work, Harriet.
Thanks, Awal, and for watching.
So anyone else want to ask a question? Yeah. So you could chat on, you could write it on a chat box, or you could also raise your virtual hand and ask questions. Okay, because there's no question, I want to ask to Harriet. So yeah, I'm interested when you say that to be indigenous is not to reproduce pre-colonial ways of being, but to translate it into present. So yeah, it ignites a question for me, like there's a challenge about this kind of indigenous literature when it transformed them into a modern medium, if we may say so. Like we try to literizing the oral, so the oral tradition try to be literized, and also we try to singularizing the plural. So yeah, I use these words. I adapt because usually in the indigenous tradition there is an oral tradition that have diversity. So it's not only one narration, but we have multi narration. So yeah, how do we come up? How do we deal with this? About the idea of literature is more better than oral, because when we try to write it, different medium, it means different way of saying. So you already said about the tradition of Daman, the both on that, and we tried it to become a literature. We write it, and the prose, it's a different medium. So yeah, how to deal with the literization and other singularizations from the plural. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question. I think, yeah, this is something that a lot of people who write about indigenous literature are dealing with when they're writing. And I spoke about this with Dicky Sender as well, and he said to me that what Lakoat.Kujawas specifically try to do is that they are creating these texts, but that doesn't mean that they're not still practicing the oral tradition. So they are keeping both up as two different ways of telling stories. And they did once have an activity where they were singing the poetry that they had written as well. So bringing the written back into the oral in a way. But it is a good question. And there's one academic who's written, Fagan her name is, and she has written extensively about this relationship between the oral and the written. And for her, they're both different. One is seen as very solid. When something is written, it can't be changed, it can't be shifted, in the same way where the oral tradition is an action, it's a practice, it's memory, rather than the technique of writing. But she argues that really it's not that different. So you're still, even if you're writing, you reproduce ideas and you can come up with different narratives. And I think I would agree that in some ways, when you look at indigenous literature, it's good because it can travel easier, I think, than the oral tradition is spoken. So these books are in Jogja now, they're also in Jakarta, they're in the UK probably. But yeah, I think it's important with what Dicky said, that the two always go hand in hand. So they still practice the oral tradition. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, it's a good point. And I think it still needs discussion, and it still needs thinking about within the oral tradition as well.
Yeah, sorry. And also about the singularizing the plural. I mean, when we write it, we don't have many version of narrations. So yeah, when I do research on some pilgrimage space, they try to rewrite the hagiography or the oral tradition of some kind of saint there, live there. But the problem is we need to choose one version of the stories of that oral literature, that kind of indigenous literature. So how, I mean, how in Lakoat.Kujawas, how they deal with this kind of many version of this narration, because when we talk about oral tradition, usually it's more diverse, like you said.
Yeah.
The writing is usually more static.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think if we go back to one of the stories that I mentioned earlier about the tree in Ajau Thomas, that's one example where there are plural stories and they have just written one. But I think for me, they're constantly developing books, that they're constantly writing. So there's no reason why one story would be written now and it couldn't be rewritten in a different way later on. I think that we talk about literature being static, but you get different volumes of books and different versions. And we see now today there's different types of novels where you can choose your own ending. And I think literature itself doesn't have to be as static as we imagine it to be too. Yeah, I think that's how I would answer that myself. I think probably Kat Dickey, as the leader of Lakoat.Kujawas, will probably say something differently and probably more articulate. But for me personally, I think the fact that literature is static is maybe not accurate too now. There's always the ability to write more, and to even within academia, we're always expanding on what other people have said and changing it for our own interpretation. So I think that's how I would answer your question.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So others, is there any questions? Or maybe Kak Dikisenda wants to comment? I think I saw, yeah. Anyone else? Okay, Mas Wiwit, Wiwit Kurniawan, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity. It's really good presentation, Ms. Harriet. Actually, I would like to know more about the situation in the local community, especially about the language aspect. I would like to know, is there any such kind of linguistic imperialism on this situation in Lakoat.Kujawas, or maybe I'm wrong? I mean that in Indonesia, the Indonesian language, Bahasa Indonesia, is very dominating in literature and daily communication. And I would like to know how the local community make a negotiation or resistant to this kind of linguistic imperialism, and how they preserve their tradition in oral and written language aspect. That's all. Maybe you can explain a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wiwit, for your question. Yeah, until today, the community of Lakoat.Kujawas, not the village of Taiftob or Molo in general, but this specific community has written so far in Bahasa Indonesia. And in talking about this, it was explained by the community that young people in the village haven't really learned how to speak Bahasa Dawan, because in school it was kind of beat out of them. If they tried to, Kak Diki said in his generation, they would be hurt if they tried to speak in Bahasa Indonesia. So there's a trauma attached to using the local language. And that's kind of moved to this current generation who they use Bahasa Indonesia as the everyday language. So these stories are all written in Bahasa Indonesia. But over the past few months, the community have developed a new program where they've taken their last book and they're working with the older people of the village who are fluent in Bahasa Dawan, who use it as their day-to-day language, to have a community relearning process. So the young people are now rewriting the stories from the previous books, which were in Bahasa Indonesia, to Bahasa Dawan. And you can kind of see this with the second book that they published, the Tubuku Batu Rumahku Bulan. You can see that the introduction of local words and a reflection on these local words within the poetry. But yeah, it's a lot more concrete now that they're having these community-driven lessons in Bahasa Dawan that they're going against the hegemony of Bahasa Indonesia, I guess.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Mas Wawan, Mas Wiwit Kurniawan. So, anyone else want to ask questions? Wait,
I would, if Kak Diki is still here, I would like to know his opinion on.
Yeah, we want to know that. Kak Diki.
But he may be busy.
Halo.
Halo, Kak Diki.
Ya, halo.
So Harriet wants to hear your response.
Oh ya, sebenarnya ini saya pakai bahasa Indonesia tidak apa-apa ya, nanti minta dibantu untuk ditranslasi. Kami berterima kasih untuk Hari dan yang sudah sudah belajar ya bersama kami, karena ini juga bagian dari apa yang sedang kami kerjakan. Jadi kehadiran Harriet bukan saja meneliti apa yang kami kerjakan, tapi juga sedang membantu kami juga merekonstruksi kembali, merevitalisasi, merawat kembali banyak hal yang kami sendiri sebagai generasi muda Timor, generasi muda Molo juga terputus. Persoalannya memang panjang dan pelik ya, terkait dengan kolonialisme, kemudian di masa Orde Baru. Salah satu contohnya adalah kewajiban kami untuk dilarang berbicara bahasa daerah di sekolah atau di ruang publik, di gereja. Itu kalau ketangkap kami dipukul di zaman itu, tahun 90-an generasi saya. Sehingga kami bertumbuh jadi generasi yang sebenarnya terasing dengan lingkungan. Itulah kenapa Lakoat.Kujawas lahir, salah satu juga dengan semangat dekolonisasi juga. Semangat untuk menyambung kembali apa yang terputus dari generasi yang sebelumnya ke sekarang. Tadi menarik ada pertanyaan tentang kurikulum, bagaimana kami membangun kurikulum. Kami punya sekolah adat, sekolah Mollo, itu sudah mulai dari sekitar 2 tahun terakhir. Itu ruang di mana kami mengundang sebanyak mungkin orang tua, tokoh-tokoh adat untuk tadi dengan semangat untuk menyambung kembali apa yang terputus itu. Karena dari pengamatan saya pribadi melihat bahwa masyarakat adat Molo itu ada ruang-ruang edukasi, ruang-ruang transfer pengetahuan adat itu terjadi ketika kegiatan-kegiatan seni budaya itu berlangsung. Tapi sayangnya semakin ke sini karena pengaruh tadi kolonialisme, kemudian di zaman Orde Baru juga ada pelarangan-pelarangan untuk aktivitas-aktivitas seni budaya. Ruang-ruang itu yang hilang. Dan ketika ruang-ruang budaya dan kesenian itu hilang, ya tidak ada lagi kesempatan untuk transfer pengetahuan karena balik lagi di sekolah formal tidak ada porsi yang cukup juga untuk pengetahuan adat. Jadi kami sebenarnya berangkat dari persoalan yang cukup kompleks, sehingga apa yang kami lakukan di Lakoat.Kujawas memang tidak sempurna, tapi kami pelan-pelan mulai menyambung kembali yang putus, menyambung kembali yang dilupakan dan segala macam. Jadi terus menyambung juga tadi ada pertanyaan tentang bagaimana kemudian kayak oral tradisi itu sangat sangat banyak versi ya, dan bagaimana kemudian ketika kami sebenarnya kerja di Lakoat.Kujawas itu adalah kerja multimedia sebenarnya. Jadi bukan saja menulis, kami juga masuk ke ranah seni pertunjukan, kami juga masuk ke ranah teater, ke musik, ke macam-macam, fotografi, film, video, sehingga kami mencoba mengakomodir banyak hal, banyak versi atau banyak keragaman pemikiran atau cerita atau narasi itu sendiri. Di menulis pun kami mencoba merangkum banyak hal, dan kalau tidak terangkum di buku itu bisa kami masukkan ke dalam medium-medium yang lain, medium-medium pencatatan, karena yang kami lakukan adalah kerja-kerja pengarsipan dan pendokumentasian pengetahuan adat dengan pendekatan yang baru. Seperti itu, mungkin itu respon dari saya. Terima kasih.
Oke, terima kasih Kak Diki.
Kak Diki.
Yeah, it's good to know that from Lakoat.Kujawas have different ways to preserve the tradition, not only through writing but also on multimedia like photography, and they also will publish a photography book if I'm not mistaken, Mas Diki?
Ya, betul. Kami diundang ke Biennale Jogja bulan Oktober ini. Lakoat.Kujawas diundang untuk menjadi penampil di sana, dan kami mencoba untuk membawa banyak kerja-kerja pengarsipan, salah satunya tentang fotografi. Jadi anak-anak masyarakat adat memakai apa yang mereka punya, dan juga kami meminjamkan kamera dan mereka bercerita tentang hutan, mata air, tentang pohon, tentang batu, tapi dari kacamata mereka. Ya.
Wonderful. Yeah, anyone else want to respond or ask? Oh yeah, we have one question from Mas Joko Widiatmoko on chat. I'll read it. Okay, it's glad to hear again about Lakoat.Kujawas. If I'm not mistaken, it was my first meeting to the joining of Wednesday Forum, which was the first time I know Diki's presentation. It looks like a progress, and it seems amazing that the education system there using that book which were written by themselves. My question, is there a conversion problem between the community school and the government school? Or how will the community anticipate that something like school accreditation there? From Mas Joko Widiatmoko. So, please.
From me personally, I don't think that there is a problem between the community school and the government school, because they're both doing different things. The community school is more focused on the wider Molo community themselves, and knowledge which can be used day to day, rather than needing it to enter into a government school or any knowledge that would really conflict with what's being taught in a government school. And likewise, the community school would never take the place of the government school. It's an additional thing to learn and to share with. But I think the two can run alongside each other without needing something like school accreditation, or without needing a conversion problem. They're complementary, I would say, rather than one wanting to replace the other. And that's my answer.
Okay. Mas Joko, you want to respond again? Okay. Okay, then wait. Okay, others want to ask a question or comment or just want to say something about the presentation, of course. And we'll see.
I think everything in this presentation is probably, I'm a lot better at writing than I am speaking. So if anyone wants to read my thesis, it's finished. But yes, thank you everyone for watching. And if there are any other comments, I would be happy to learn from others too, because it's all still progress. It's all still in a process as well.
Do you plan to, publish your thesis maybe? Yeah, so
I wasn't planning on it, but it's available if anyone wants to contact me for it.
okay, so anyone, if you are interested in the topic or you want to get the thesis from Harriet, you could contact her, or you could contact her through CRCS or just directly to Mbak Harriet. Yeah. So, is there anyone else want to ask question? Okay, Anju, say something.
Yes. Harriet, thank you very much. Thank you, Abdi. Harriet, working on this, looking at how the Lakoat.Kujawas has been working. What would be the expecting it to be community school, expecting it to be effective for doing what they're doing for their goals. What would be, in your thought, the most challenging factors for them to develop? And comparing to other, other indigenous communities, struggling for getting recognition, getting into the public discourse, for them, to get recognized and even to get power for, whatever struggle they are struggling for. So what would be the most challenging, again, factor that they would face? And in addition to that, if you have a kind of strategies in order to face that, for them to be effective in reaching their goals, would be also wonderful to hear. Thank you, Harriet.
Very, very big questions, Masanchu. So for your first question about the challenges, from my discussions with Kakdiki, I think the biggest challenges the community faces and the region of Mollo, primarily are land-based challenges currently, issues of the development of tourism or the potential for tourism, which is not done sympathetically to the land, or is large scale and could have environmental implications. Or perhaps there's always the threat that mining or some kind of extractive activity could come back to the area as well. There's also the food estate that is developing in not in Molo, but in Timor, and the one of the areas that Lakoat.Kujawas really focus on is on food and on local food, and on different pulses and on biodiversity within food. And I think these are some of the challenges that are being faced right now, is where there's a large there's nothing that is happening now, but there's this looming potential for something like mining or large-scale tourism or the food estate, which is taking place. So I think how can a community at once try to bridge the gap in knowledge between generations as they are doing now, and also prepare for what could potentially happen, which is sometimes feels a little bit out of their control. I think they probably know a lot better about what strategies would work. I think there's lots of when things like this happen, or there's something that they disagree with on a local government level, there's ways where the community will bring adat leaders to the front, or the church has raised its voice. And so if Lakoat.Kujawas acts as a bridge between adat and the church, then I think what they're trying to strengthen this power of the village people who don't have the power of being government or adat or in the church itself, if that makes sense. I think just if they continue developing themselves as they are, if they continue making all of these different projects and these books and their own agricultural practices, and I think that is enough strength. And you can see people, I myself being one who is drawn to looking at what they're doing and looking at what they're achieving and what they're creating. And they have a large network now, more than any other adat community I've seen in Indonesia. So they're doing something right with what they're doing presently. I would say if they continue as they are and continue working on creating the sense of strong identity for the community, that is as much protection as they really can, or as much as they can solidify themselves with. I think that's my answer, Mas Anju.
Thank you very much. Abdi, if I may follow up a little bit.
Okay, sure, Anju.
Thank you. Yeah, in addition to that, I was actually thinking also about, the specific topic you are talking about, the indigenous literature. You're doing it under your thesis at CRCS. So you kind of like bring the topic, the subject, indigenous literature into CRCS circle, into the, which we could expect, one subject to develop at CRCS. So how would you, what would you suggest for us, studying religion, studying indigenous people, taking literature, indigenous literature as another subject, to develop in the study of religion? What would be the most significant point for us to engage, with this topic, indigenous literature, for developing the study of religion, especially indigenous religions? Does it offer a very important subject or point, to pursue by taking up the specific topic, which is literature, indigenous literature?
That is also a good question. I think looking at literature or arts, in my time at CRCS, there wasn't ever a class on arts or literature or multimedia expression offered. So I think maybe indigenous literature itself, the more I look into it, the more I don't know whether it is fully the right name or the right field that would be the most beneficial for Indonesia. I think literature definitely is. And I think if there was a way that there could be more study of literature in CRCS, that could be useful. But I also go back and forth between liking my thesis topic or not. Sometimes I think by having indigenous literature, it's very restrictive. It puts communities in boxes as well. So they can only be an indigenous author if they are indigenous and also writing. And sometimes I think the discussions that are taking place within Indigenous literature maybe don't fit Indonesia particularly well either. Maybe it's better in the context of North American literature or just because the dynamics are different. But I think there's a big space in CRCS to look at literature, and that wouldn't have to just be Indigenous literature. That could also be literature written across religions. There's so much writing that is happening in Indonesia that's looking at issues of religion on a local level, or even on a national level. Or I think there's a space to develop arts within CRCS as well. I know it has been in the past, but just when I was studying, there wasn't any classes on it. That's a slightly different answer to, I think, your question, but that's yeah, I think that's what I would imagine would be useful at CRCS is looking at literature too as a multidisciplinary subject.
Okay, thank you.
Andrew.
Oh yeah, yeah. Is there any questions? If not, yeah, I want to follow up actually from that Anjus and Kak Digisenda also and Harriet said about the indigenous literature. So Kak Senda said that when we talk about indigenous literature, it's not only about the written, actually, the written traditions or the written expressions, because yeah, you know, we have oral literature that it's not written, of course. And then so the answer is, could we expand the, you know, the meaning or the form of the indigenous literature, not only in written tradition, but also in yeah, another form of expression, like there's a poem, there's a video, photography, or maybe on food, like what usually Kak Senda do in Lakoat.Kujawas. So he then give us a knowledge about how the corn and other food other than rice that help them during the 65, and they try to acknowledge that kind of food, something like that. So yeah, maybe that's the one of the question, that could we expand the idea of this indigenous literature. So and yeah, I also reflect that when we study at CRCS, one challenge to study about indigenous literature is based on my experience is the letter of the indigenous literature. Sometimes we lost the alphabet of this kind of indigenous letter. Usually we write only the translation from that other academia, usually from the Dutch. For me, it's Japanese. Usually I just read from the Dutch what they translated, but not from the first sources, for the primal source, because I have challenged to read again in my own traditions or something like that. It's a good thing, Anju, to give more perspective on that.
There's a good book that's been published recently by an academic, Chadwick Allen, and his book is called Transindigenous Literature. So he wants to move away from looking at indigenous literature as something that's compared. So you compare literature from this community with this community, or from this country to this country, but instead looking at how there are shared histories. Sorry, Andrew, could you mute your microphone?
Yeah, already.
Okay. How there are shared histories that are often found within indigenous communities. So within this book, he also mentions how literature for indigenous communities shouldn't just be text. It shouldn't be novels or poetry, but it should include woven stories, because that is also something that we read. So how to expand it, further than just written literature, to include all all forms of literature, but to give it that same status, that same quality that we often see literature has.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. I think, yeah, there's no more questions. And thank you very much, Harriet, for almost 1.5 hours tour to Lakoat.Kujawas. And thank you, Kak Dikisenda, for coming and give your responses and information about Lakoat.Kujawas. So I will not conclude this presentation because yeah, each one of you has your final conclusion. So let the thousands flowers bloom. So yeah, and don't forget next week in the same hour, we have Krishna Yogi Pramono, who will talk about atheism in Indonesia. So if you are considering to be becoming an atheist or want to know more about being an atheist, you need to come next week. So see you on next Wednesday. Thank you very much. Stay healthy and stay happy. Assalamualaikum.
Thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Harriet.
Thank you. Bye, Harry.
Thank you, Harriet.